I'm reading today from Revelation chapter 22, beginning in verse 6. And he said to me, "These words are trustworthy and true. And the Lord, the God of spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. And behold, I am coming soon. Blessed is he who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. I, John, am he who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me. But he said to me, 'You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brethren the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God.'" Amen. Now that we are coming to the near conclusion of John's great revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ, we are reminded that we complete this journey in exactly the same fashion that we began the journey. And if you recall, verse 3 of chapter 1 said, "Blessed is he who reads aloud the words of the prophecy. And blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written therein, for the time is near." The intent of this revelation has been none other than to bring us into the full awareness of the blessing of God. It has been, I think, a bit of an emotional journey in that we have dealt with all kinds of responses to what God has said will soon take place. It's been sometimes awe-inspiring. It has been sometimes frightening. It has been most times hopeful. And sometimes truly we've looked at it with some dread. But through it all, God intended this one thing. And that one thing was that it would be a blessing. I have received that blessing because in the beginning it simply says, "Blessed is anyone who reads this out loud." It's been my blessing to do that. And I would suggest any of you that are in any state of life where you are desiring a blessing from God, here's a simple way to do it. Just read this out loud. It also was a promise that it was a blessing to hear it, and a blessing to be obedient unto it. That blessing is framed in two ways. One, it has to do with the soon return of Jesus Christ. It is so important that we never lose hope in that. I know that for some of us, we've heard that Jesus is coming all our life. And so did our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. I suppose that if you went back to 1780 and talked to my great-grandfather, John Shields, arrived from Ireland, but only in Ireland for a short while. Before that, the family came from Scotland. Well, he arrived as a Scot Presbyterian. But even back then, he would have said, yes, Jesus is coming soon. It's that question that Peter will deal with. You need to remember, he says, that a single day in the Lord is like 1,000 years. But that he is coming back. Physically, in history, in the flesh, he will return. See, without that promise, then what the faith becomes is a quest for spiritual enlightenment. In the hopes that as we understand things a little bit better, we then will ascend unto heaven and continue our eternal journey. It's not what the Bible teaches. We are not in a quest simply for enlightenment. And it's because this world matters. See, if all we are concerned about is spiritual enlightenment, then it really doesn't matter. In fact, interfering in the spiritual realm, in the physical world, would be messing with somebody's spiritual journey. But this world matters unto God. He created it, and he intends to return to it and perfect it. It matters. The world matters to God. And so as we've gone through this book of Revelation, the parts that tend to be hard for some is when we try and bring these visions into the historic present, with the sense that perhaps the fulfillment of this revelation, the pieces are coming together now. And as we look for some way by which it might be fulfilled, to suggest that now is this time and these particular events are part of the plan, becomes a challenge for some. We'd rather keep it in the realm of spiritual metaphor. But Jesus is coming soon. That's what we were told at the beginning. And that's what we're told at the end. And we don't know when soon is. And as soon as you figure it out and give me a date, I'll guarantee this one thing. You're wrong. So we're left simply with the hope of soon. But it's not so much the when that grants us this great foundation of a blessing, but the fact that it is in time. That it's not just a metaphor. That it is and will come about in history. We're told also that the other foundation upon which this blessing rests, the blessing that life matters, has been proclaimed by the prophets. Excuse me. I had to turn it off. One of them is dying over there apparently. So John is told, by the angel himself, that he is part of his brethren, the prophets, that these words are true and trustworthy, not just here in this final book, but in the prophets themselves. And we'll close our service today by reading from Luke, and when Zechariah, John's father, prophesies. And there he's going to make mention of the prophets of old, which is always an interesting phrase to me, because it's the word that is used for forever. It's translated of old. And I always wonder, what exactly does it mean by that? The prophets, really what it's saying is from the beginning. There were prophets who proclaimed what the blessing would be. And one thing that we know for sure, that the blessing is not simply just spiritual enlightenment. But we also know for certain, as we've gone through this book of Revelation, and we have been told how much of the material world is lost through it all, that God's blessing is not also limited to material wealth. And we tend to use the word that way. I've been so blessed, by which we generally mean something good has come into my life. Well, that is a blessing. But it's not limited by these two poles of strictly material or strictly spiritual. That the blessing, as we will be reconfirmed, is our salvation in Jesus Christ. That is the blessing which we live with. And we live with it here, in this physical world, as physical people. So I fear there's this tendency to separate these two and somehow arrive at the spiritual understanding. Doesn't have much to do with the worldly life with it. But yet, somehow at the end, it's brought together. And it's knit together by Jesus Christ. To live in this time and in this place is to live on the cusp of soon. But it's also to live with the constant awareness that no matter what may befall the world about us, we are established in the salvation of Jesus Christ. And that changes how we live. It changes the fear that we might have about facing our own mortality and death. I've discovered that amongst all my friends in Pine Valley, we're all on first name basis with the physical therapist. We understand our mortality. We understand this in this physical world. And yet, we are blessed because we know the salvation of Jesus Christ. I was visiting with a man who I just met. I didn't even know him. And he started to tell me a lot of personal things, and I thought, oh boy, this could be interesting. But he ended up with this fear of the world. And he asked, is there any hope? And I said, of course there's hope. I said, I believe in Jesus Christ and eternal salvation. Whatever happens here, there's hope on the other side. It was at that point he needed to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
The world can be a frightening place right now. And we are challenged to even understand what's going on. And yet we have this assurance that we are blessed because of our salvation in Jesus Christ. And that's what this whole journey is meant to be. Meant to be a blessing. What that word means, the closest you could translate it if you didn't come up with blessed, would be happy. But happy in the sense of confidence in Christ. Not happy in the way that my nieces celebrated St. Patrick's Day. I have no influence in their life. And so we live in the blessing. It's who we are now. It's a blessing that's not simply about spiritual wisdom. It's a blessing that's not simply about possessing of the material world. It's a blessing that in the material world we have the promise of eternal salvation. And we can walk this world in spite of what happens. Blessed and even happy. Being happy sometimes causes your friends to say, "What is wrong with you?" Nobody's that cheery all the time. There's a few that are just that way by nature. But the rest of us, we can be called to that. Because we're blessed. And if you need that blessing in your life, it's easy to obtain. Read this prophecy aloud. God promises that's a blessing. Listen to it. God promises that's a blessing. And then obey it. And that's another blessing. Threefold blessing. And in the end, after all that blessing, there's a simple command. Worship God. Enjoy your blessing. And worship God. And you're going to be as happy as Pam.